murmuring came from the living room as Brenda left her children's room. She found herself in the living room, surrounded by her husband and his friends. Their concentration was engrossed in a card game, which she found no interest in. She sat down, allowing her head to rest against the back of the chair. She sat, unfocused, allowing the dull roar of voices and the soft light from the television to lull her into a peaceful state. It was in that moment that she found her eyes growing heavy, and she allowed herself to be enticed into sleep.
Brenda.
The soft voice of her husband stirred her as she came to. A peculiar feeling had washed over the living room. It was a heavy sensation that hung in her chest as she opened her eyes, looking towards her husband.
Brenda, so help me God, would you do something about Natalie? She's playing in the cupboards again.
He said, exasperated, as he sat back, taking a drag of his cigarette.
I've truly had enough of this what goes in the night BS, Brenda. It's always something with this child. If it isn't her imaginary friend, it's her doll. I've had it.
He said angrily, stabbing his cigarette into the ashtray. Brenda leaned back in her chair, peering into the kitchen. She noted a single cupboard door left ajar. A sharp sound of rattling pots and pans drifted into her senses. She glanced back at her husband with a confused look. He shook his head, returning his attention to the card game that was, much to her surprise, still taking place. Brenda carefully pulled herself from the chair and crept into the kitchen. "Natalie," she called softly as she walked into the kitchen. When she heard no response, she called again. "Natalie, honey, it's late. You really should be in bed." She scolded her daughter softly as she knelt down to the cupboard. Once again, she heard the pots and pans rattling. She gripped the edge of the door and pulled it open, and found nothing but her pots and pans, moving and shaking to an unknown rhythm. She gasped, turning towards the doorway where her husband now stood, looking at her with fear. "Barry, Natalie's not in the cupboard." With that being said, the door left her hand and slammed shut.